This week we're going to continue our conversation about the emotional intelligence competencies, resuming with interpersonal. Specifically, we'll be covering the last three of the skills: assertiveness, independence, and self-awareness. As a refresher, when we're talking about interpersonal, we're talking about the individual or self. We're focusing on one's self-awareness and self-expression, and the implication is that before we can influence others, we have to have mastery of ourselves. Last week we covered self-regard and emotional self-awareness. This week we're going to finish up by covering assertiveness, independence, and self-actualization. When we're assertive, we can effectively and constructively express our emotions and express ourselves. When we're independent, we're self-reliant and free from an emotional dependency on others. When we are self-actualizing, we are striving to achieve our personal goals and fulfill our own potential. The first skill we're going to cover today is the assertiveness skill. Amy Gallo, in the Harvard Business Review, in an article titled "How to Be Assertive Without Losing Yourself," talks about a few key points. First, she talks about a sweet spot for assertiveness. This means that you can be too assertive or not assertive enough. Instead of doing that, you need to find that balance where you have proper assertiveness. As part of doing that, you need to know the culture you're going to be working with or in. It could be national, it could be regional, it could be within your own organization. Another key point she makes is that gender matters. Whether we like it or not, women have a smaller range of assertiveness that they can work with. Before you go into a situation, you need to know what you want. You need to know your objective. That will give you focus. Prior to going into it, you can run through or practice the type of experiences you might have. There's not a need to be surprised. Pretty much we know what we're going into before we get there, or at least we have a good idea. If we don't, then we need to do some research and figure that out. Lastly, it's important to build relationships. That's a way that we can break down barriers and make ourselves more comfortable and make those we're working with comfortable and confident in our abilities. Ms. Gallo talks about three principles that we need to do when we're looking at our assertiveness. The first thing is to understand our own abilities to be assertive and not be afraid to ask others for feedback to check us. The second thing would be to set realistic goals and be willing to make the necessary changes in our own behavior and then stick to those changes. Lastly, we need to build relationships with others in settings outside of work so that we can be more comfortable when the time comes that we need to speak up or when they need to speak up. Along with the things that we should do when we're trying to learn how to be assertive, there are also some things that we need to not do. One is to assume that assertiveness is always a good thing. The context in which we're working and our gender both matter, and sometimes we don't need to be assertive. Other times we need to look to imitate someone else's behavior, someone who's successful at being assertive. We can change what we're doing and still be true to who we are. Another thing that people do is overcompensate and become too aggressive. There's a balance of assertiveness, and we need to be considerate of others and not go overboard. A closing thought that Gallo expressed had to do with teamwork and the role of assertiveness. She states, "Assertiveness is most appreciated when it's in the service of the team." The next skill we're going to look at is independence. In an article titled "Confidence, Excellence, and Independence" from Entrepreneur Magazine, it looks at business lessons from 4 great leaders. Great leaders often have great lessons that they've learned that they can share with us, and when we look at those, we want to look for patterns that we can follow. They teach us that we cannot control all of our circumstances, but certainly we can control our response to a given circumstance. The first quote we're going to look at comes from Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company. In this quote, we want to look at the need for us to be confident in who we are. His quote says, "If money is your hope for independence, you will never have it. The only real security that a man can have in this world is a reserve of knowledge, experience, and ability." I think it's common for entrepreneurs to know that money can come and go based on how an investment progresses, but you can always take your knowledge and experience and your abilities with you. The second quote has to do with being able to think independently. This comes from John D. Rockefeller. He's the founder of the Standard Oil Company. He states, "If you want to succeed, you should strike out on new paths rather than travel worn paths of accepted success. Being innovative and willing to take risks is where new opportunities present themselves." The third quote has to do with knowing when to move on, when to cut our losses and go. This comes from presidential candidate Donald Trump, who's also an entrepreneur, a television personality, and an author. He says, "Part of being a winner is knowing when enough is enough. Sometimes you have to give up the fight and walk away and move on to something that's more productive." A smart and successful businessman knows when his investments aren't returning what they need, and so he needs to move on and find other avenues to make money. Our last quote comes from entertainer and entrepreneur Jay-Z. When he's talking about independence, he talks about the pursuit of excellence, not fame. He states, "Having success for a year or two, that's called being hot, being in demand. Excellence is being able to perform at a high level for a long period of time. Having a good staying power, ability to continue to return successful results in the long run and over time, that would be a sign of a successful business person, a successful manager, and a successful entrepreneur." The last of our skills under the self-awareness and self-expression category or competency is self-actualization. For this, we're going to turn to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're not going to go into detail about that, but the simple explanation of it is that at the bottom of a pyramid, at the base where it's the widest, that's where we have all of our basic needs, and most of us spend a lot of time there, or when we're prioritizing, that's our highest priority. And then our needs or priorities move up until we get to the very top, the peak of the pyramid, where it's most narrow, and this is self-actualization. This is the smallest market if we were looking for opportunities, but because of that, it has the most growth potential. Recently, with the improvement of communications, we're increasing the ability to have an economy that spans the globe. And this might serve better to help meet basic needs. Well, if we're meeting more basic needs, then there's more opportunity for our higher needs to be addressed and met. Right now, there's not a big supply of businesses and such that address the higher needs of self-actualization. So this creates an opportunity for somebody that can take advantage of that. In his article on self-actualization and the opportunities in the market for that, especially in a global economy, Pedraza draws this conclusion. If you have an insight into a need that hasn't been met, and you can think of a scalable way to meet that need with a product or service that costs less than you can charge for it, you're in business. That's opportunity. This week, the conclusions we can draw from the attention to assertiveness, independence, and self-actualization as much as it was last week. The statement I put up is, we will no longer be at the mercy of our emotions. Instead, we will take control of them and be the determinants of our own destinies. This concludes my presentation on assertiveness, independence, and self-actualization. On this slide, you'll see the references to the sources I used for the information I presented today. Thank you.